My name is Serafina Martinez, and I'm 28 years old. What should have been my sister's perfect wedding day became the moment that shattered everything I believed about family loyalty. As I stood there in my bridesmaid dress, humiliated in front of 200 guests, watching everyone laugh at the adopted girl comment, I had no idea this moment would trigger a chain of events that would expose decades of lies destroy relationships, and ultimately serve the sweetest justice I could have ever imagined. Hey everyone, before we dive into this absolutely wild family drama that changed my entire life, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below if you're ready for a story that has more twists than a soap opera. Hit that like button now and don't forget to subscribe, because trust me, you won't want to miss how this family revenge saga unfolds. This is one of those stories where karma doesn't just knock, it breaks down the door completely. Growing up, I always felt like something was off in my family, but I could never put my finger on it. My sister Cordelia, 3 years older, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. She had this way of making snide comments about my appearance, my achievements, even my friends, but always with a smile that made everyone think she was just being playful. "Oh, Sarah's just different," she'd say with that trademark smirk whenever I'd excel at something she couldn't. My parents, Robert and Eleanor Martinez, owned a successful chain of boutique hotels across California. They were pillars of our community, always hosting charity events, always in the society pages of local magazines. But behind closed doors, there was this subtle hierarchy that I never understood as a child. Cordelia got the bigger bedroom, the better birthday parties, the more expensive gifts. When I questioned it, my mother would always say, "Cordelia's the oldest dear." That's just how it works. I threw myself into academics, and later into my career in graphic design, thinking that if I just achieved enough, worked hard enough, maybe I'd finally earn their approval. I graduated summa cum laude from UCLA, started my own successful design firm by 25, and even bought them a beautiful anniversary vacation to Europe with my earnings. But somehow it was never enough. Cordelia could post an Instagram photo of her breakfast and get more praise from our parents than I'd get for landing a major client. The comments about my adoption started when I was around 12, but they were always framed as jokes. "Oh, we found Sarah in a basket on the doorstep," Dad would chuckle at dinner parties. Lucky for her, we decided to keep her. Everyone would laugh, including me, because what else do you do when your family makes you the punchline? I'd learned early that questioning these jokes only made things worse. Looking back now, there were so many red flags I should have noticed. Like how I was the only one in the family with green eyes while everyone else had brown. How my birth certificate always seemed to be somewhere safe whenever I needed it for school trips or passport applications. How baby photos of me were noticeably scarce compared to the dozens of Cordelia's infancy documented in elaborate albums. But the biggest red flag was how differently Cordelia and I were treated when we made mistakes. When she wrecked Dad's car at 17, it was an accident. These things happen. When I accidentally broke Mom's favorite vase that same year, I was grounded for a month and had to work extra shifts at my part-time job to pay for a replacement. When Cordelia dropped out of college twice to find herself, it was exploring her options. When I took a gap semester due to a health issue, it was irresponsible and disappointing. The wedding planning process had been particularly brutal. As the maid of honor, I was expected to help with everything, from addressing invitations to coordinating with vendors, but my input was rarely valued. Cordelia would ask for my opinion, then immediately dismiss it. "That's such a Sarah idea," she'd say, which had become her code for weird and inappropriate. She chose my bridesmaid dress in a color that she knew looked terrible on me, insisted on a hairstyle that didn't suit my face shape, and made sure to schedule the bachelorette party for a weekend when she knew I had a major work deadline. but I endured it all because I loved my sister, or at least, I loved the idea of having a sister who might someday love me back the way sisters in movies seem to love each other. I kept hoping that maybe after her wedding, after she was settled and happy, we could finally have the relationship I'd always dreamed of. The morning of the wedding, I arrived early to help Cordelia get ready. I'd spent weeks working on a surprise, a beautiful hand-designed photo album documenting our childhood together, with custom illustrations I'd created of all our happy memories. I was so nervous but excited to give it to her. When I presented it during her pre-wedding preparations, she flipped through it quickly and said, "Oh, that's nice," before handing it to her actual maid of honor, her college roommate Jessica, and asking her to put this somewhere safe. I watched Jessica toss it carelessly onto a pile of gift bags, and my heart sank a little, but I told myself she was just stressed about the wedding. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Cordelia had always had exquisite taste, and no expense had been spared. The venue was a stunning oceanside estate decorated with thousands of white roses and flowing silk drapes. I stood at the altar with the other bridesmaids, smiling and playing my part perfectly, even though Cordelia had positioned me at the far end of the lineup, partially hidden behind a large floral arrangement. During the reception, I was looking forward to finally relaxing and enjoying the celebration. I'd worked so hard to make sure everything was perfect for Cordelia's day. I'd coordinated with the caterers when there was a last-minute menu change, helped calm down our crazy Aunt Margaret when she had a meltdown about her table assignment, and even fixed a torn seam on one of the flower girls. Dresses with a sewing kit I'd brought just in case. But when it came time to find my seat for dinner, I discovered that my place card wasn't at the family table where it should have been. Instead, I was assigned to table 12. In the back corner with distant cousins I barely knew, and family friends who clearly didn't want to be stuck at the kids' table equivalent for adults. I figured it was just an honest mistake, so I walked up to Cordelia, who was holding court at the head table, surrounded by her new in-laws and closest friends. "Hey, Cordy," I said quietly, trying not to make a scene. "I think there might be an error with the seating chart. My card has me at table 12. She looked up at me with that familiar smirk, the one I'd seen countless times throughout our childhood whenever she was about to deliver a particularly cutting remark. But this time there was something different in her eyes, something cruel and calculated that I'd never seen before. "Oh, that's not a mistake," she said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "That's exactly where you belong. Go find another table if you don't like it, adopted girl." She waved her hand dismissively like she was shooing away an annoying insect. The words hit me like a physical blow. Around us, conversation stopped. Her new mother-in-law gasped. Some of Cordelia's college friends started giggling nervously. And then someone, I think it was her maid of honor, Jessica, actually started laughing. "Oh my God, Cordelia, you're terrible," she said, but in that tone people use when they think someone's being hilariously outrageous rather than genuinely cruel. More laughter rippled through the nearby tables. People who had known me my entire life were laughing at my humiliation. I felt my face burning with shame and confusion. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just Cordelia being typically mean, this was something else entirely. The way she said adopted girl wasn't like her usual teasing. It was like she was revealing a truth that she'd been keeping secret, savoring this moment to finally use it as a weapon. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. My parents were at the table, and I looked to them for support, for someone to tell Cordelia that she'd crossed a line. But Dad was suddenly very interested in his wine glass, and Mom was making small talk with the person next to her as if nothing had happened. That's when I knew. In that horrible, crystal-clear moment of understanding, I realized that everyone at that table, my parents, my sister, probably half the guests at this wedding, knew something about my life that I didn't know. Something about my identity, my place in this family that had been kept from me for 28 years. I somehow managed to walk away without completely falling apart, though I could feel tears threatening to spill over. I grabbed my purse and headed for the bathroom, needing a moment to collect myself. In the mirror, I looked at my own face, really looked at it, and for the first time I allowed myself to acknowledge what I'd been unconsciously noticing my whole life. I looked nothing like them. Nothing at all. When I came out of the bathroom, I overheard two of my mother's friends talking by the dessert table. I can't believe Eleanor never told her one was saying. It's going to come out eventually, especially now that Cordelia's married and starting her own family. The other woman nodded. Honestly, I think it's cruel to have kept it from her this long. That poor girl has no idea what's coming. They saw me approaching and immediately changed the subject, but it was too late. I'd heard enough to confirm what I already knew in my heart. I walked back to table 12, sat down with the strangers and distant relatives, and made polite conversation for the rest of the evening, while my mind raced with questions and my heart broke into smaller and smaller pieces. The next morning, I woke up with a determination I'd never felt before. I was done being the family secret, done being the punchline, done accepting scraps of affection from people who apparently saw me as fundamentally different from them. I called in sick to work and spent the day diving into research that I should have done years ago. First, I requested my birth certificate from the county office. When it arrived 2 days later, I stared at it in disbelief. Robert and Eleanor Martinez were listed as my parents, but something about the document felt off. The paper was different from other official documents I'd seen, and when I looked closely, I could see faint marks where it looked like information had been altered or covered over. I took the certificate to a document expert who confirmed my suspicions. It had been modified. The original information had been carefully removed and replaced with different names. It was a sophisticated job, but not perfect. Under UV light, we could still see traces of the original text. Next, I hired a private investigator. I know it sounds dramatic, but at this point, I needed answers more than I needed to save money. Within a week, Patricia Chen, the PI I'd hired, called me with preliminary findings that turned my world completely upside down. Serafina, she said gently, I need you to sit down for this conversation. According to Patricia's research, I wasn't adopted at all. I was Robert Martinez's biological daughter, but not with Eleanor. My real mother was a woman named Carmen Rodriguez, who had worked as a housekeeper for the Martinez family when I was born. Carmen had been young, barely 19, and when she became pregnant by her married employer, Eleanor had made her a deal that would change all our lives forever. Eleanor, who had been trying unsuccessfully to have a second child after Cordelia saw an opportunity, she convinced Robert that the best solution for everyone was for them to raise me as their own, while Carmen would receive a substantial sum of money and a promise of ongoing support in exchange for her silence and departure. Carmen, scared and with limited options, had agreed. But here's where the story gets even more twisted. And this is the part that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. Carmen never willingly gave up her rights as my mother. Eleanor had forged documents, bribed officials, and essentially stolen me from my biological mother while making it look like a legal adoption to the outside world. The PI had tracked down Carmen, who was now living in Mexico with the family she'd eventually built there. Through Patricia, I learned that Carmen had spent 28 years wondering what happened to the daughter she'd been forced to leave behind. She'd tried to contact the Martinez family multiple times over the years, but Eleanor had threatened legal action and convinced Carmen that any attempt to reconnect with me would result in her being charged with extortion. As I'm sharing this part of the story, I need to pause and ask, have you ever discovered something about your family that completely changed how you see your entire life? Because right now, I really need you to hit that like button. If this story is resonating with you, and don't forget to subscribe, because the revenge part of this story is going to blow your mind. What happens next is the kind of justice that makes you believe karma is real. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Not just about the lies, but about the systematic emotional abuse I'd endured my entire life. Cordelia had known the truth since she was 16. Eleanor had told her during one of their mother-daughter bonding shopping trips, and they'd been laughing about my pathetic attempts to fit in ever since. I also discovered why I'd always been treated as less than. In Eleanor's mind, I was living proof of her husband's infidelity, a constant reminder that she hadn't been enough for him. But rather than direct her anger at Robert, she'd chosen to punish an innocent child. Every dismissive comment, every comparison that made me feel inadequate, every time I was excluded from family decisions, it had all been deliberate. The wedding humiliation hadn't been spontaneous either. I found text messages between Cordelia and her friends, thank you PI technology, where they'd planned the whole thing. They'd actually discussed the best way to finally put Sarah in her place and had been looking forward to the moment for weeks. The seating arrangement, the public humiliation, even the specific phrase, adopted girl, it had all been carefully orchestrated. But the discovery that broke my heart the most was finding out about Carmen. Patricia showed me photos of my biological mother, and the resemblance was unmistakable. We had the same green eyes, the same smile, the same artistic hands. Carmen had become a successful artist in Mexico, specializing in the same type of illustration work that I'd gravitated toward naturally. She had 2 other children now, my half-siblings, and from the photos, Patricia showed me she looked happy, but with a sadness around her eyes that I recognized from my own mirror. Patricia also uncovered financial records showing that Eleanor had been systematically stealing from my trust fund. Yes, apparently I had a trust fund that no one had ever mentioned. Robert's father had set up substantial funds for both his granddaughters, but Eleanor had been siphoning money from mine for years to fund Cordelia's lifestyle and her own shopping habits. The final piece of the puzzle was the most infuriating. I learned that Robert knew I'd started asking questions after the wedding. He and Eleanor had discussed managing the situation to make sure I didn't dig too deep. They'd actually considered bribing me with money to keep quiet, as if I were just another problem they could throw cash at and make disappear. That's when I knew I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to systematically dismantle the foundation of lies they'd built their perfect little family on, and I was going to make sure everyone who had laughed at me that night understood exactly what kind of people they'd been. Supporting. I spent the next 3 months methodically gathering evidence while pretending everything was normal. It was harder than I expected, smiling and making small talk with people who had been lying to me my entire life, but I channeled my anger into focus. Every family dinner, every fake phone call from Cordelia about married life, every time Eleanor asked if I was feeling better after the wedding stress, I documented everything while building my case. Patricia continued her investigation, and we uncovered even more disturbing details. The money Eleanor had promised Carmen, most of it had never been paid. After the initial payment to secure Carmen's silence, Eleanor had made only a few token payments before cutting off contact entirely. Carmen had been left to raise her family in poverty while believing that her sacrifice had at least secured a good life for her eldest daughter. We also discovered that this wasn't Eleanor's first time manipulating documents and situations to get what she wanted. She'd falsified insurance claims for the hotel business, manipulated property records during real estate deals, and had even forged Robert's signature on several important business documents over the years. The woman was basically a criminal mastermind hiding behind charity galas and society luncheons. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: Cordelia herself. In her excitement about being a newlywed, she'd been careless about her phone security, and her iCloud backup was syncing to an old iPad that she'd given me for work purposes years earlier. Through this, I gained access to months of text messages, emails, and even voice notes, where she and Eleanor discussed their plans for keeping me under control. One voice message sent just 2 days after the wedding was particularly revealing. In it, Cordelia was laughing as she told Eleanor about how pathetic I'd looked at the wedding and how satisfying it had been to finally put the little bastard in her place. She went on to say that she hoped this would finally make me accept my role in the family and stop trying to compete with her for their parents' attention. Another text exchange between Cordelia and her maid of honor, Jessica, showed them planning to spread rumors about my mental health if I started asking too many questions about my origins. They discussed telling people that I was having a breakdown and couldn't be trusted, essentially trying to discredit me preemptively. But perhaps the most valuable evidence was a series of emails between Eleanor and the family lawyer discussing the Serafina situation. In these emails, Eleanor explicitly stated that she wanted to make sure I could never successfully challenge my legal status or claim any inheritance rights. The lawyer had advised her that her position was legally precarious since the original adoption paperwork was fraudulent, but Eleanor had dismissed his concerns, saying that I was too naive and trusting to ever figure out the truth. Meanwhile, I was also working with Patricia to locate Carmen and arrange a meeting. This was delicate. I didn't want to cause her pain or disruption, but I needed to know my real story and potentially gain an ally in seeking justice. Patricia served as an intermediary, explaining the situation to Carmen and confirming that I wanted to meet her not to disrupt her life, but to finally learn the truth about my origins. Carmen's response, translated from Spanish by Patricia, made me cry for the first time since the wedding. She said she had prayed every day for 28 years that I was happy and loved, and that she would welcome the chance to meet me but didn't want to cause problems in my life. She had kept a box of things for me: photos, baby clothes, letters she'd written but never sent, hoping that someday she might be able to give them to me. I also used this time to quietly research my legal options. I consulted with several attorneys, including one who specialized in cases involving fraudulent adoptions and identity theft. The legal consensus was clear. What Eleanor had done constituted multiple serious crimes, including identity theft, fraud, embezzlement, and even kidnapping under certain legal definitions. The attorney I eventually retained, Maria Santos, was particularly passionate about the case because she'd handled similar situations involving wealthy families exploiting vulnerable women. She explained that not only could Eleanor face criminal charges, but I could also pursue civil suits for the money stolen from my trust fund, emotional distress, and other damages. But I wasn't just interested in legal justice. I wanted social justice, too. These people had built their reputations on being pillars of the community while privately committing crimes and emotionally abusing a child. I wanted everyone who had laughed at me that night to understand exactly what they'd been witnessing. So I began planning something that would expose everything at once in a way that would be impossible to cover up or spin in their favor. I started by reaching out to journalists who covered local society news and business affairs. I contacted former employees of the Martinez hotel chain who might have witnessed Eleanor's questionable behavior over the years. I even hired a forensic accountant to trace all the financial irregularities we'd uncovered. The plan that emerged was ambitious but necessary. I was going to host my own event. A family reunion that would actually be the setting for the most epic truth reveal in our family's history. But first, I needed to make contact with Carmen and get her side of the story directly. 3 months after the wedding, I flew to Mexico to meet Carmen Rodriguez, my real mother. Patricia had arranged everything carefully, making sure Carmen was comfortable with the meeting and that we'd have privacy to talk without interruption. I was terrified and excited in equal measure, not knowing what to expect from a woman who'd been forced to give me up before she'd really had a chance to know me. The moment I saw Carmen waiting in the small cafe in Guadalajara, I knew I was looking at my real family. The resemblance was striking. Not just the green eyes and facial structure, but the way she held her hands, the way she smiled nervously, even the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. All the mannerisms I'd been told were quirky or different suddenly made perfect sense. Carmen stood up when she saw me, and for a moment we just stared at each other, both crying. Then she said in accented but clear English, "Mija, you are so beautiful. So much more beautiful than I even dreamed." We hugged, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. The sensation of being held by someone who was genuinely, unconditionally happy to see me. Over the next 3 days, Carmen told me her story, and I told her mine. She shared the box she'd kept for me, filled with photos of me as a baby that I'd never seen, handmade baby clothes she'd sewn before I was born, and dozens of letters she'd written to me over the years. Reading those letters, messages from a mother to a daughter she'd been forced to abandon, was both heartbreaking and healing. Carmen explained that she'd been just 19 when she started working for the Martinez family. She'd come from a poor family and needed the job desperately. Robert had been kind to her at first, and when he began making advances, she'd been too young and scared to know how to handle the situation. When she became pregnant, she'd hoped Robert might leave Eleanor and they could be a family, but that was a naive dream from a teenager who didn't understand how power and money really worked. Eleanor's solution had been presented as generous. Carmen would receive $50,000 immediately, plus $2,000 per month for 10 years, in exchange for signing papers, giving up her parental rights, and leaving the state. For a 19-year-old with no resources and no support system, it seemed like the only option that wouldn't result in complete disaster for everyone involved. But Eleanor had lied about almost everything. The monthly payments stopped after just 6 months, and when Carmen tried to contact the family, she was threatened with legal action for harassment and told that any attempt to see me would result in her being charged with extortion. She'd been convinced that any contact with me would destroy my life and her own. Carmen had spent years feeling guilty about abandoning me, not understanding that she'd actually been the victim of an elaborate crime. She'd eventually married a wonderful man named Miguel, had 2 more children, my half-siblings Rosa and Diego, and built a happy life, but she'd never stopped wondering about her first daughter. Meeting Rosa and Diego was incredible. Rosa, now 24, was an art teacher who shared my love of design and illustration. Diego, 22, was studying engineering but had a musician's soul. He played guitar and wrote songs that reminded me of the poetry I'd loved as a child. They welcomed me immediately as their sister with no awkwardness or reservation. Their acceptance was so natural and warm that it highlighted just how dysfunctional my relationships with Cordelia and the Martinez family had always been. But the most important thing Carmen told me was that she wanted to help me seek justice, not just for my sake, but for all the other vulnerable women who might be exploited by people like Eleanor in the future. She'd kept every document from our original interaction, including communications that proved Eleanor had made promises she never intended to keep. Carmen also revealed something that made my blood run cold. About 5 years earlier, Eleanor had contacted her unexpectedly, claiming that I was asking questions about my background and needed Carmen to sign additional documents confirming that she'd never wanted contact with me. Carmen had refused, but the fact that Eleanor had tried to manipulate her again showed that she'd been planning for this possibility for years. We decided that Carmen would come to California for my planned family reunion event. She wanted to confront Robert and Eleanor face to face, and she wanted to meet the people who had raised her daughter to understand what kind of environment I'd grown up in. Most importantly, she wanted to publicly reclaim me as her daughter and make it clear that she'd never willingly given me up. Before I left Mexico, Carmen gave me a locket that had belonged to her grandmother, the grandmother I'd never known I had. Inside was a photo of Carmen holding me as a baby, a photo I'd never seen before. She told me she'd worn this locket every day for 28 years, keeping me close to her heart even when she couldn't have me in her life. Flying back to California, I felt like a completely different person than the one who had been humiliated at Cordelia's wedding just months earlier. I wasn't the confused, desperate for approval girl who had spent her whole life trying to earn love from people who saw her as an inconvenience. I was Carmen Rodriguez's daughter, a woman with a real family who loved her unconditionally, and I was about to make sure everyone understood exactly what that meant. The family reunion I organized was scheduled for Robert's 60th birthday, an event I knew Eleanor would want to make perfect for their social circle. I sent out invitations to everyone who had been at Cordelia's wedding, plus journalists, business associates, and several surprise guests that the Martinez family wouldn't be expecting. The venue was the ballroom at the Martinez hotel chain's flagship property. Poetic justice, since it was paid for with money that should have partially belonged to me anyway. I told Eleanor I wanted to plan this event as a peace offering after the misunderstanding at Cordelia's wedding, and she was so pleased by what she saw as my finally accepting my place that she gave me complete control over the Candons. Planning. The morning of the event, I had the room set up with a professional sound system and large screens for a multimedia presentation that I told everyone would be a tribute to Robert's business success and family life. Carmen had arrived the day before and was staying at a hotel nearby along with Rosa Diego and my attorney Maria Santos. As guests arrived, I played the perfect hostess, greeting everyone warmly and making sure they all had drinks and appetizers. Cordelia and her husband were there. Eleanor was holding court in her finest dress, and Robert was beaming as friends and business associates wished him happy birthday. Everyone who had laughed at me that night was present, including Jessica and several of Cordelia's college friends. About an hour into the party, I called for everyone's attention to begin the tribute presentation. The lights dimmed, and the first slide appeared on the screens. A beautiful photo of the Martinez family, from a recent Christmas card with the caption, "The Perfect Family." Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my father's birthday. I began emphasizing the word father just slightly. I wanted to take this opportunity to share some family history that I think you'll all find very interesting. The next slides showed photos from my childhood. Me at various family events, always positioned slightly apart from the others, often with that forced smile I'd perfected over the years. As many of you know, I'm the adopted daughter in this family. At least, that's what I was told my entire life. I could see Eleanor's face starting to change as she realized this wasn't going to be the tribute she'd expected. Cordelia was looking confused, and Robert had gone pale. But recently I discovered something fascinating about my adoption story. It turns out there are some significant inaccuracies in the version I was told. The screen now showed my fraudulent birth certificate alongside the evidence of tampering that the document expert had identified. You see, I'm not actually adopted at all. I'm the biological daughter of Robert Martinez and a young woman named Carmen Rodriguez who worked for this family 28 years ago. The room was completely silent now, except for a few gasps from people who were putting the pieces together. The presentation continued with bank records showing the payments that had been promised to Carmen but never delivered, legal documents proving that the adoption paperwork was fraudulent, and text messages between Cordelia and Eleanor discussing their plans to keep me in my place. But the real shock came when I introduced Carmen herself. I'd like you all to meet my real mother, Carmen Rodriguez, who flew here from Mexico to tell you her side of this story. Carmen walked onto the stage with dignity and grace, and the resemblance between us was so obvious that several people actually gasped out loud. In clear, strong English, she told the assembled crowd about how she'd been exploited as a young employee, how her baby had been essentially stolen from her through fraud and manipulation, and how she'd spent 28 years believing that staying away was best for her daughter. The final part of the presentation was a recorded statement from my attorney explaining the criminal charges that would be filed against Eleanor Martinez for fraud, identity theft, embezzlement, and conspiracy. She also announced the civil lawsuits that would be seeking damages for emotional distress theft of my trust fund money and the financial losses Carmen had suffered over the years. When the presentation ended, the room was in complete chaos. Some people were shouting questions, others were quietly slipping out, and the business associates were clearly horrified to learn they'd been dealing with people involved in such serious crimes. Eleanor tried to deny everything, but we had too much evidence. Robert just sat in his chair looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Cordelia, true to form, tried to make it about herself. "How could you do this to Dad's birthday party?" she shrieked at me. "You've ruined everything. That's when I delivered the line I'd been saving for months." "Oh, Cordelia," I said with a smile that I'd learned from watching her all those years go find another table. "The real daughter is talking now." The sound system picked up her gasp of outrage perfectly, and several people actually started clapping. Karma, it turned out, had a sense of humor. Within 2 weeks, Eleanor was arrested on multiple charges. The story made national news because of the dramatic way it was revealed and because it highlighted issues of exploitation of immigrant workers by wealthy families. Cordelia's marriage fell apart when her husband realized the kind of family he'd married into, and she lost most of her social circle when the extent of her participation in the cruelty became public knowledge. Robert wasn't charged criminally since he could prove that Eleanor had handled most of the fraud without his direct involvement, but he was required to pay substantial restitution to both Carmen and me. The hotel business suffered major losses when the scandal broke, and several business partnerships were terminated. As for me, I got my trust fund back, plus interest and damages. But more importantly, I got my real family. Carmen, Rosa, and Diego have become the loving family I always dreamed of having. We spend holidays together, we talk every day, and I finally understand what it feels like to be loved unconditionally. I've also become an advocate for other people who've been victims of adoption, fraud, and family exploitation. Through media interviews and speaking engagements, I've helped expose similar cases and connected victims with resources for seeking justice. Looking back on that wedding day humiliation, I can honestly say it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Without Cordelia's cruelty, I might never have discovered the truth about my identity or found my real family. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually doorways to something better. So, I want to ask you, have you ever experienced a moment where someone's cruelty actually led to something positive in your life? Share your story in the comments below, because I read every single one, and your experiences help other people feel less alone. If this story of family karma and justice served cold resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others find it. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life drama stories and share this video with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes the truth really does come out and justice really is served. Thank you for going on this journey with me. And remember, your real family is the people who love and accept you exactly as you are. Life has a way of removing the wrong people from your story and bringing in the right ones at exactly the right time. Trust the process, seek the truth, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve love and respect. The best revenge really is living well and loving authentically.